But first we want to start off with Dr. Roland Faber, who is the founder and executive director of the Whitehead Research Project. Will say a few words.
So, welcome everybody. It's great to have you here. This is the 9th International Conference of the Whitehead Research Project, which means we exist at least for 9 years, but it's in fact a little longer, it's 11 years. So we had like a celebration of 10 years existence of the WRP last year with the conference, and probably I'll do the 10th conference next year, and then so we have a second jubilee going on. So I want to say two things to you. First of all, when I came to Claremont the second time, in fact, 11 years ago, 12 years ago, there was no preparation for the Whitehead Research Project. There was no money for it. It was a sheer act of will in which I projected the idea to be real out of nothing and said, or chaos, whatever you prefer, right? Yeah. So, and there was only a bunch of students, 5-6 students of like the first generation for the research project who were eager to do something about Whitehead. And we pulled it off with a webpage and with invitations and making kind of a goodwill tour around certain people, seeing it kind of around and would you be interested. And then there was the first conference, 2007. And we got for this first conference already interesting people. We had this conference on Whitehead, but also Deleuze and Badiou. And we got the Australian translators of Badiou here. They were like a performance act. In a sense, that was really like a bang start. And we kind of went with this streak of continental philosophy and postmodernism. And I think the peak of that, you could say, is Julie Butler having been here. And also last year to the conference, the last one we had, the 8th one, the translator of some of the books of Deleuze, so that's Brian Masumi, and his partner Erin Henning, I think being one of the last ones having had a PhD with Jacques Derrida, but they got interested in Whitehead and kind of translated their thought patterns into Whiteheadian thinking, and they created their own group over years to read Whitehead with people, interestingly not just academic people. And that was something that interested me too for this conference. So that's kind of this streak. Then 2007 also Brian came on board. The idea being for the Whitehead Research Project to be not just about the philosophy or the philosophical mechanisms of Whitehead, but also the text of Whitehead. And one big element was the vision to get a whole edition on Whitehead's work started, and even unpublished things or related to Whitehead, as the first book that now was published finally brings that real act of 10 years to reality. I think that's a great achievement. One thing we haven't achieved is Eve. EVE from Evelyn Whitehead, this idea of a cosmos, of a virtual universe of all things related to Whitehead that could be accessed from different perspectives, but also pedagogically, some people could be guided by their level of interest through the Whitehead universe. That would need some money and also some technically inclined people to make it happen. I mean, some serious money, I guess, to make that happen. And we have tried with certain grants and so on, but it didn't materialize yet. That would be a great dream. But I think we have come far. Second point I want to mention is in the late 90s, by accident, I discovered a manuscript of Hartshorne, which was one of these that you are having published now, again, republished. So it was kind of notes from, I think, 1925-26. And I began to transcribe them, and it was a hard work. I think I needed a year to do it, like every week, so much of it. And I figured I cannot just do it in a transcription, but I had to kind of also space it the way it was spaced on the manuscript because it was written in such a way that you might get more out of it if you see where it was written on the pages. So that's kind of hard work, so I can just imagine for everybody else who has done some transcriptions, as some of you have done, this is really a hard work of love. You cannot get paid enough for transcriptions. It's not happening. But in the middle of it, suddenly the word creativity appeared. And it was before the publication of Religion in the Making, and so to say, after Science in the Modern World, where he doesn't use the word yet. He uses a similar word, but not exactly this one. And so it was kind of really finding the origins of the mind of Whitehead in some way. And I think the publication of these notes might give us, you, and everybody else in this world a better understanding of the mind of Whitehead. So to say, another virtual world of Whitehead being created by it. And finally, I hope that this whole project really gets to the point to republish all works of Whitehead, including some things we don't know yet, and biographical stuff and so on, despite all the publishers who do not want us to do that because of their own money and rights, maybe, and we need a long time to overcome most of these problems, but you did it. And so we are here today, and I'm glad you could come. Okay. Let's get started.
Thank you, Roland.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Brian Henning. I'm the executive editor of the edition, and I enjoy going to conferences like all of you, but this one, I've just been so excited to come to this meeting. In part, it's because, as we were joking in the back, usually this work is tedious and solitary and time-consuming, and so this is sort of fun to come and celebrate having actually something physical, some physical manifestation of all of the hard work that has been put into it. That Paul and Jason, and has Jason joined us yet? Not yet.
He's not here yet.
Okay, so. What I did, I mean, I've got my paper and you've looked at that. What I've got tonight, though, is I tried to capture as best I could from all of my scattered notes from the last 10 or so years, the history of the edition. And so I'd like to go through that with you tonight as a way of starting off with sort of a little bit of a intellectual history, institutional memory that we can relay, have in front of us as a context for then our deliberations over the next couple of days. So, some pictures and some text. So, this august gathering of scholars is being convened to celebrate a momentous achievement, the publishing of the first volume, the critical edition of the complete works of Alfred North Whitehead. In addition to celebrating this achievement, my goal in hosting the conference is to jumpstart the scholarly community's engagement with these new materials so expertly edited by Paul Bogart with the help of Jason Bell and Joe Petek. Each of you is focusing on a different aspect of Whitehead's work and considering the impact or lack of impact of the Harvard and Radcliffe lectures. Taken collectively, I expect that you will have a robust set of answers to offer the broader philosophical community, and we hope to be able to publish these as a volume with the contributors we'll have for over this conference and a couple more people who couldn't make it here. If you'd indulge me a bit, I thought that a good way to start our time together this evening would be to share the story of how the critical edition came to be. Relaying some of this institutional memory should be helpful context for our philosophical and editorial discussions over the next few days. So the story, as I know it, started about 54 years ago in 1963 at Yale University. At the encouragement of Whitehead's former student, Paul Weiss, who was at that time a professor at Yale, the Graduate Philosophy Club, which included people like Karl Vaught, and as I've just recently learned, like last night, John Lango, started contacting Whitehead's former students to ask if they could be able to transcribe their notes from Whitehead's classes. The graduate students ended up with 6 sets of notes and began the work of transcribing and verifying them. Tragically, the original set of one of the notes, I believe it was those of the Canadian A.H. Johnson, went missing. In their apologetic letter to Johnson, they indicated one member of the student had left the notes for another student outside of their dorm room door. But someone, perhaps the cleaning staff, had thrown them away. And Johnson was a bit of a Whitehead groupie. And so this is terrible. This is a tragic sort of thing for poor Johnson. So unfortunately, though, this first Whitehead project was not to be. After 3 years, in 1966, the students felt compelled to abandon their project with only 2/3 of the 6 sets transcribed, some verified, and none of them edited. To be honest, I'm amazed that they kept at it as long as they did. In our case, today, even with graduate students collectively working 30 hours a week for more than 5 years, and with all of the benefits of modern word processing and graphic editing, it has been a Herculean task to transcribe a bit more than half of our own materials. And as George and I have discovered with the 1925-27 materials, the work of verifying those transcriptions is exceedingly time-consuming and painstaking work. I can only imagine how difficult it would have been for these poor graduate students trying to transcribe handwritten notes using only typewriters. Yeah. In the end, the students were forced to abandon the project and deposited their manuscript in the Yale Library, and that is where we found it a half-century later. 2 decades later, after the Yale students' failed attempt, an unrelated group decided it was time to work on a proper critical edition of the monographs. They had no intention of publishing the lecture notes, as I just met with John Cobb a few hours ago, and he confirmed they never had any interest or intention of publishing the notes, just the monographs, which is already a big enough project, of course. John explained that inspired by Griffin and Sherburne's 1979 corrected edition of Process and Reality, in the late 1980s, a team from the Center for Process Studies, led by John Cobb, applied for a scholarly editions and translations grant from the NEH to fund the start of a critical edition. According to John, they had even lined up individual scholars who would edit particular texts. Unfortunately, when their application was denied, they decided they had to abandon the project. The time for Whitehead edition had not yet come. My own part in the story begins a decade later than that, in the late 1990s. I was a student at Fordham University in New York, where I was doing my doctoral studies with Jews. One day I had gone to the university's Walsh Library to find a copy of one of Whitehead's works, only to find that his various monographs were not shelved together in the philosophy section, as I had hoped. Instead, Adventures of Ideas was shelved with the sociology works, Aims of Education was in the education section, and so on. I looked enviously at the 30-odd volumes of the complete works of Dewey, with their handsome volumes all consecutively shelved, and I thought what a great intellectual injustice it was that Whitehead didn't have a proper critical edition. It was little more than a passing thought at that time, but I resolved to see what, if anything, could ever be done about it. After finishing my dissertation in late 2002 and graduating the next spring, I spent the first couple years of my career rewriting my dissertation into a book, and then I turned my attention to other scholarly projects. One of those was exploring the idea of the critical edition. Having learned that copyright issues had been a key problem in previous attempts, I set about to learn what I could about copyright law and intellectual property. When the Copyright Act was first enacted by the United States Congress in 1790, copyright protection only extended for 14 years. Over the intervening centuries, it has been extended again and again, until today, unpublished works are copyrighted for 70 years from the author's death. Note, in the case of the lecture notes, the author is the note taker. For example, Bell or Hawking or Heath, not the subject of the notes, Whitehead. On the other hand, published works published before 1923 are already in the public domain in the United States. Thus, all of Whitehead's pre-Harvard works are in the public domain, according to US copyright law. However, registered works published after 1923 have continually had their copyright protection extended by successive acts of Congress. Why? For me, the unexpected answer has to do with Walt Disney and his first animated cartoon, Steamboat Willie. Every time this 1928 work has come close to entering the public domain, Disney mounts an all-out campaign to have the duration of copyright extended. The result? Because of a poorly drawn cartoon mouse steering a boat, most registered works published in the United States after 1923 now have copyright protection for 95 years from their publication date. Sheesh. That means that Steamboat Willie's copyright protection expires 6 years hence in 2023. But works published in 1923 will start entering the public domain in roughly a year, 2019. Very soon, we're going to find out if hordes of Disney corporate lawyers and lobbyists will once again emerge cicada-like to extend Willie's copyright. What we know is that if the law is not changed, and it's not at all clear whether it will be, I would guess if they're going to do it during the next 3 years would be the time to do it.
Yes.
Whitehead's post-London published works will start entering the public domain in 2020. And to the extent that there are unpublished materials by Whitehead himself, for instance, his own personal correspondence, copious amounts of which we've actually found, those works entered the public domain this year, 70 years after his death. While doing this copyright research around the year 2005, 2006, I had contacted the then new executive director of the Center for Process Studies, Roland Faber. Roland expressed interest in the critical edition, but asked if I could contact him a half year later as he was in the middle of, I recall, moving, applying for tenure, and getting married, and like 12 other things, I think. Not knowing Roland very well at the time, I had feared that he was just putting me off. I thought, it was just brand new, who was I, right? So, however, once things settled down, true to his word, Roland did contact me. In fact, to my surprise, he asked if I'd serve as the director of research and publication for a new group that he had started the year before, in 2005, called the Whitehead Research Project. And I happily agreed, and the Whitehead Critical Edition was begun. Although I had learned much about American copyright law, I was still having difficulty determining the exact IP status, the intellectual property status of Whitehead's works in particular, as this, I had been told, had been a matter of some dispute. My various searches brought me in 2008 to the process scholar Peter Farley in Australia, who was familiar with one of Whitehead's heirs, a certain Simon Whitehead, the great-grandson of Alfred North. Simon is from the British side of the family. Apparently, Alfred North Whitehead's son, T. North, and just here's a sort of a sketch of a family tree of portions of it. Apparently, Alfred North's oldest son, T. North, remarried after his first wife died. The son of his first wife, Eric Arthur, is Simon's father. Why it is considered the British side, I'll explain in more detail later on. With Peter Farley's help, I contacted Simon, and it proved to be helpful, as Simon was able to put me in contact with the person who did hold the rights to Whitehead's estate and intellectual property, a certain George Whitehead. George Whitehead still lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in fact, not far from Alfred North Whitehead's home at Radnor Hall. As I will explain in more detail later, George Whitehead's the son of T. North's second wife, Harriet, and the person who inherited the estate when his mother passed away. I was able to contact George Whitehead by email and then later by phone, and he was very generous in his willingness to work with us. Indeed, Mr. Whitehead wanted to do right by his grandfather, agreeing to allow us to publish anything that was of scholarly significance. I'll return to this in a little bit more detail in a bit. So as the scale of our project started to come into view, I realized that we needed a senior scholar with extensive editing experience and exceptional knowledge of the history of Whitehead scholarship. And I was happy to find the ideal partner in George Lucas, who generously agreed to join the edition as our general editor in 2010. The first phase of George and I's work focused on officially securing copyright permission from George Whitehead, applying for funding from the NEH, constituting an editorial board, and most especially scouring internet archives for anything by Whitehead. I'll explain a little bit more detail in a minute, but George Whitehead had confirmed to us that his grandfather had indeed instructed the family to burn his effects. Right? This has been known within the community for a long time, but his grandson was able to confirm that, in fact, that was the direction from Alfred North. So there had long been concern in the community that traditional Nachlass had been already lost forever and an edition was not really possible. However, searches soon discovered an abundance of material that had been squirreled away in archives all over the United States, Canada, and Europe. It's hard to overstate the profound impact that the digitization of libraries' archival holdings has had on this sort of research and why this project was really only possible at this stage. The scale of the current project, with 6 projected volumes of Harvard lecture notes alone, simply could not have been possible without the advent of the internet and the digitization of archival holdings. With the publishing of finding aids online, it finally became possible to discover materials that had long lay hidden in library archives. Our holdings have now grown from several hundred items when we first began to more than 1,300 items of several thousand pages today. My point is that we shouldn't be too hard on those who were digging in the Whitehead mines before us. The robust shape and direction of the current critical edition was really only possible at this mature stage of the internet and electronic digitization of archival holdings. Indeed, because this digitization is for libraries an ongoing process, we have taken to doing an annual search of certain archives on Whitehead's birthday every year in February. In fact, most years we find something new. Indeed, just a few days ago, I discovered that there might be some Whitehead correspondence with Macmillan hiding in the dark spaces of the New York Public Library. Though we've had wonderful success in finding materials, we've had decidedly less success in securing funding. With failed attempts at NEH grants in 2009, 10, 12, 13, and 17. I don't know if you've ever applied for an NEH grant, but it's about an article's worth of work. And then at the end, you have absolutely, well, either a couple $100,000 or nothing to show for it. In our case, being the latter. This last time, with George's help, submitted through Notre Dame, we came excruciatingly close. Got the best reviews we've ever gotten. It was just one reviewer. And so very, very close. So, however, unlike in the past where that was the death sentence for the project, fortunately we were able to find this time a generous private donor who has been willing to help provide financial support for the project. In fact, that donor has provided some of the support to make this conference happen. Starting in 2013, this donor has annually provided enough financial resources to allow us to hire graduate students at Claremont who could work on obtaining materials, cataloging them physically, digitizing them, and then especially transcribing them. The first assistant editor, I hope I get all of this right, I apologize if I missed somebody, was Jeremy Fackenthal, followed then by Nathan Greeley and John Becker and Tyler Hewson and Joe Petek and now Andrew. And Jason, thank you. I knew I was going to miss somebody. Richard Livingston, also a student, served as a technology consultant, making sure that we used best practices in terms of digitization, storage, and presentation, and helped to design our research database, the Whitehead Research Library. After years of invaluable contributions, Joe Petek was invited to serve as the edition's chief archivist and assistant editor. Joe. Indeed, Joe's contributions are really hard to overstate. Joe has made so many contributions that George and I asked him recently to join us on the second volume of the critical edition and serve as a named editor of the volume. I think it'd be really appropriate, since he helped us to organize this conference and has done more than probably anybody else on the daily grind of the Whitehead Project, to thank Joe for all of his work.
You're here.
Along the way, we became aware of a couple of other projects that other scholars were working on that might relate to the edition. In not chronological order, I'll present them. The first one was a project being pursued by Nicholas Griffin at McMaster University, the home of the Bertrand Russell archives. Nick was invited to this conference, in fact, but he has pledged not to come to the United States as long as our current president is in office. So he refused to attend, but he's going to hopefully contribute an essay for the volume. Nick Griffin has been working on the correspondence between Whitehead and Russell around their publishing of the Principia Mathematica, and has agreed to include his volume in the critical edition. In a sense, the second project found us more than we found it. Jason's still not? No, shoot. In a sense, the second project was found by Jason Bell, who will be here, I guess, tomorrow. In 2010, I think, Jason discovered the notes of Winthrop Pickard Bell, no relation to Jason Bell. He found them in the archives of Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, Canada, of all places. I don't know what that sounds, I don't mean it as an insult. It's just a random sort of place. While Jason was working on another project concerning Winthrop Pickard Bell's notes from his time working with Husserl in Germany. Jason had come upon, by accident, notes that Bell had taken of Whitehead's first year of Harvard. And to his credit, Jason knew that he'd discovered something special. I believe that Jason initially contacted his former professor, Randy Augsher, for advice about what to do with them, considered maybe publishing them in the process study supplements, and so had contacted Dan Dombrowski, and Dan had then sent him in our direction. So at this point, it was becoming clear that we needed to convene a meeting of the editorial board. With support from the Hocking-Cabot Fund for Systematic Philosophy, George Lucas and I were able to host the first meeting of the editorial board at Harvard University in April of 2012. I find it a wonderful, it's a wonderful coincidence that the money that was funding that meeting came from two of Whitehead's close associates. William Ernest Hocking, one of the people who helped hire Whitehead, attended his first year of lecture notes, are included in this volume, Hocking. And Cabot, Dr. Richard Cabot, was a teacher at Harvard, and Whitehead did a guest lecture in his social ethics class, and those notes will probably become a part of the second volume of the edition as well. So the Hocking-Cabot Fund is supporting this work in a really wonderful way. Around this time, and while still trying to decide what to do about the Bell notes, George Lucas and I learned that, as luck would have it, there was already an eminent Whitehead scholar at Mount Allison University, none other than Paul Bogard, who wrote his dissertation under the famed Ivor Leclerc at Emory. I got that right, yes? In July of 2013, George Lucas and I made a pilgrimage to Canada's beautiful Maritimes to see the Bell notes and to meet with Paul and Jason to see these Winthrop Picker Bell notes. By the time our meeting ended, we had formally agreed that Paul and Jason would be ideal to edit the first volume of the critical edition with Bell's notes as the centerpiece. What we needed was a publisher. The ultimate goal for the critical edition has always been to publish both print and electronic editions. And I mention that because the NEH has moved increasingly away from print editions and only wants to support 100% digital editions. So all the new editions of philosophers like the Royce papers and others are all 100% electronic and no print editions at all. So we needed a publisher who was willing to take on an enormous and likely unprofitable project that would run for decades. In the process of trying to determine the copyright status of Whitehead's works, in 2009, I'd already approached Free Press, which, as we know, owns the publishing rights to Whitehead's post-London works in the United States. Free Press, formerly Macmillan, was acquired by Simon & Schuster, which is itself a subsidiary of CBS. It is odd to think that the company that produces shows like NCIS and The Big Bang Theory also publishes Process and Reality. I contacted the copyright division of Free Press to see whether they would be interested in being the publisher of the critical edition, if they would be, we could honor them with this. And after bugging them for a long time to respond to my emails, to no one's surprise, they said they were no longer interested in projects of this sort. So my search for a suitable publisher then led me to a British firm called Pickering & Chatto. Negotiations began in 2010 and continued for several years. They tentatively agreed to publish the edition and were even included in several of our NEH grant applications. However, they were slow to reply, and there was concern about whether they were the right home for the project. Luckily, in September of 2013, one of the members of our editorial board, Lehman McHenry, who should be here tomorrow, contacted us regarding a conversation that he had had with an editor at Edinburgh University Press. While Lehman was visiting as an American Philosophical Association Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at Edinburgh University, an editor of EUP expressed interest in our edition project. After a year of negotiations and a blind peer review of our series proposal, in March 2014, George and I signed a contract officially making the project the Edinburgh Critical Edition of the complete works of Alfred North Whitehead. Confident that we had collected much of what was available in archives, we considered the first phase of the edition complete and looked to proceed to the second phase, laying out the publishing of specific volumes. In a meeting here at Claremont in January of 2015, George Lucas, Joe Petek, and I planned out the first volumes of the edition. And with a second round of support from the Hocking-Cabot Fund, later that year, we held a second meeting at Harvard, this time with scholars who would actively be editing volumes. This meeting concluded with an agreement to publish 6 volumes of Harvard lecture notes, 1 volume of Cambridge lectures, and 2 volumes of correspondence, with the monographs to follow that in chronological order. So to bring this story to a close and up to the present, I'd like to share with you the rather unforgettable experience that George Lucas and I had in March of this year when we were invited to have tea with Whitehead's grandson, George Whitehead, at his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is really nice because several years before that, I was on a plane. I'd already flown from Washington to Minnesota and was going to meet with George Whitehead and have dinner with him. And there was a blizzard in Boston, and the airport was closed, and I had to go back home, and I never made it. And so this was nice to finally be able to meet him. George and I came bearing gifts, in addition to presenting Mr. Whitehead with an advanced copy of the first volume of the critical edition. Oh, I forgot. I'll mention Radner in a second. This is part of our field trip during the second editorial meeting. This is where Whitehead lived. So we came bearing gifts. We brought a copy of the edition. George also brought a number of facsimiles of some items that we had discovered in the archives at Mount Allison. Apparently, Winthrop Picker Bell became friends with T. North Whitehead, and T. North had sent a number of items to Bell, and Bell had saved those and kept them in his own files. They included, for example, a picture of George Whitehead's half-brother, Eric, and their father, T. North, on a sailboat. It also included a letter from T. North to Winthrop Picker Bell, and finally a picture of George Whitehead himself when he was about 3 years old. All of these items had been saved by Bell, right, became T. North's friend. I myself brought several items. I brought Whitehead a copy of the diaries of Charles Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh, both of which include rich accounts of the Lindberghs' visit to the Whiteheads in Cambridge, Massachusetts on January 3rd of 1940. I found George Whitehead to be an amicable, bright, and hospitable man who warmly welcomed us into the sitting room of his lovely Cambridge home with fresh coffee and bagels. He appeared to be in his late 60s and in good health. He was quick to smile and welcomed us into his home. It was weird to have him say, "Hello, I'm George Whitehead." I don't know why, it was just weird. After pleasantries and the presentation of the various gifts, the Georges settled into armchairs and I into a couch, and the conversation lasted about 90 minutes. Below are some of the things that we discussed and discovered. According to George Whitehead, his grandmother, who lived in his childhood home when he was growing up, she pronounced her name with a long E, as in Eve, rather than a short E, as in Ellen. Thus, Alfred North's spouse pronounced her name Evelyn Wade Whitehead, not Evelyn Whitehead. We also learned that French was Evelyn's first language, even though she was English-Irish, because she grew up in a French convent. According to George Whitehead, or as he put it himself, according to Whitehead family lore, it may have been Evelyn who pushed A.N. Whitehead to accept the position at Harvard. She believed that he was not sufficiently appreciated or sufficiently paid, given his stature within the intellectual community. Evelyn also made their business arrangements. We found a letter between Evelyn and, I think it was Macmillan, and she was trying to negotiate for the copyrights. And she clearly had no idea what she was doing, but she was driving a hard bargain. She argued for, I think, 30% royalties, which I don't think is a thing that has ever happened in the history of publishing. But she was trying. She was trying to get a really good deal. So good for her. According to George Whitehead, after World War I, T. North married a war widow, Margot Schuster. Go back to the family tree, who had 2 children, not on here, a boy and a girl from a previous marriage, Roy and Sheila Dane. Together, Margot and T. North had, as we know, Eric Whitehead, named after T. North's brother, who died in the First World War. As we know, A.N. and Evelyn moved to America in 1924. T. North and his family continued to live in England until about 1933 or 1934, at which time they followed their father, A.N., to America, taking up residence in Cambridge. T. North started teaching at the business school at Harvard and taught some of the first business courses for women at Radcliffe. When World War II started, T. North went back to England and, according to his son, was, quote, reporting pretty directly to Churchill in the Foreign Office. He had signed, though, the Secrets Act and dutifully refused to share details about what he did during the war. T. North's first wife died just after the war of cancer, and he remarried later an American woman from Ohio. This was George's mother, Harriet. His father, T. North Whitehead, died in 1969 of complications from Parkinson's. According to George Whitehead, Roy and Sheila Dane, that is T. North's adopted children, or George Whitehead's step-siblings, I think that's right. I'm terrible with genealogy.
Yeah.
They both went to Bedales boarding school in Hampshire, England. Bedales. That's how we pronounced it? Bedales. Boarding school in... 5 minutes? Sheila married a Harvard professor, Myron Calmore, who lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for most of her life, and she had herself 2 boys and 2 girls. According to George Whitehead, Eric Whitehead, George's half-brother, finished middle school at Shady Hill in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just a mile or so from where George Whitehead lives now, but decided to stay in England after boarding school, thus the English side of the Whitehead family tree. Eric had 2 children, one of whom is Simon Whitehead, who lives today in Exeter. Simon himself has 2 children who would be Alfred North's great-great-grandchildren. George Whitehead confirmed that his grandfather, A.N., did indeed direct Evelyn to destroy all of his personal papers upon his death, and he further added that, to his knowledge, this instruction was carried out not only by Evelyn, but that T. North inherited this promise and dutifully destroyed any notes or manuscripts that he found, for instance, after his mother Evelyn died. Curiously, this contradicts one of the stories that George Whitehead himself shared with us at the end of our conversation. He said the following: at the beginning of the war, I think it was World War I, T. North was in need of a warm coat, his pistol, and some other items. Evelyn packaged them up from Cambridge and mailed them to him. However, they didn't arrive. Still needing the coat and the pistol, she bought new ones and got permission from Lloyd George to travel from the UK to Paris, where she stayed with Stein and Toklas. During her time in Paris, Evelyn received several very personal letters from her husband, Alfred North, and George Whitehead, their grandson, suggested that they reveal a side of Alfred Whitehead that we don't normally see, that they are overflowing with his love for Evelyn. Remarkably, George Whitehead, to my mind, implied that he in fact still had these in his possession. Is that your impression? But it's not, he said he would not share them because they were too personal. So not all of the materials were destroyed after all. I asked him to consider not destroying them as so many other items have been. Perhaps in another decade or 2, they might be made available. Time will tell. So, final story. According to George, his parents, Alfred North and Evelyn, were cremated. There is no plaque marking where their ashes are interred, though there is a record of their cremation at Mount Auburn Cemetery. However, there is a plaque in Whitehead's honor at Trinity College, as many of you know, and its Latin inscription reads, this inscription commemorates Alfred North Whitehead, Order of Merit, who was fellow of the college for 57 years. He was for some time lecturer at Trinity and then professor of mathematics in London. Next, he was professor and later professor emeritus of philosophy at Harvard University. Hence, he could be said to have lived 3 lives in 2 countries. The first devoted to mathematics, the second to physics, and the third to metaphysics. He was a fellow of both the Royal Society and the British Academy, a model of broad culture, if any man was. He died on 30th December 1947 at the age of 87. And here we are, 70 years later. Thanks. We're overtime. I see you were telling me I was overtime.
Yes.
Sorry, bud. I apologize.
This was actually getting cutting off a little.
Is you're just going to do that the same?
I don't know, we'll find out.
All right. Do you want me to put it down?
Yeah, I'm going to put it up.
You want the lights down more? Is that
Sure.
Can the lights go down a little bit more in the front?
Not sure if you can.
No.
I think they're on or off. The front to the back is all together.
Yeah, leave it as it is. It's fine. See if this is going to work. Oh, well, not ideal, but it'll work. So my name's Joe Petek. I was hired as the Whitehead Research Project Assistant in February of 2013, so I've been here for about 4.5 years transcribing stuff. Now spent almost 5 years searching for, cataloging, transcribing, and editing thousands of pages of archival material related to Whitehead. Brian has jokingly referred to this work as the Whitehead Mines, from which I've derived the title of my paper, Tales from the Whitehead Mine. My understanding of Whitehead's philosophy has, of course, grown in that time. On countless occasions, I've been transcribing notes from Whitehead's classes and come across some particularly keen insight that I would then excitedly share with my colleagues at the Center for Process Studies, but I've also found myself fascinated by the people whose work we are collecting and editing, both Whitehead and his students, and the moments when they suddenly seem to come alive, usually from some funny story or odd connection that reminds me that there were real people behind the words on the page. There's probably no better position in the world than the one I'm in for getting a picture of Whitehead the man and his students and contemporaries. Of course, Victor Lowe wrote a 2-volume biography that illuminated much about Whitehead that would otherwise have remained obscure, and it continues to be the best single source of information about Whitehead's life available. That said, over the years, we've uncovered things that Lowe never saw, materials ranging from the profound to the inane. As I am lucky enough to be at the center of WRP's acquisitions, it seemed entirely appropriate that I should kick off the conference by painting a picture of Whitehead and his Harvard students as people to provide the human context to the philosophical work. The people of 8 decades ago can often seem remote, dead. Even though we know intellectually that they were people like any others, it is all too easy for them to seem unreal and abstract. My ultimate goal in sharing the following stories and materials is to jolt the reader into a felt realization of Whitehead and his students and contemporaries as living people, as I have been pleasantly jolted on various occasions in my work at WRP. At the end, I'll also briefly examine some of the challenges involved in gathering and editing Whitehead materials. I want to focus mainly on Whitehead in America and his students at Harvard and Radcliffe. Nonetheless, I would like to lead off with a few recently discovered materials relating to Whitehead's life in England. I don't think I can begin anywhere other than with the recent discovery of various Whitehead photos from his time at Sherborne School in Dorset. Brian Henning had contacted the school back in 2010 looking for any material that related to Whitehead, but got little for his trouble. It was bad luck on his part because less than a month after he contacted Sherborne, they hired an archivist named Rachel Hassel, who since her hiring has been working to raise Whitehead's profile at the school and highlight their connection to him. A chance conversation with a colleague at CPS led us to contact the school again this past August, leading to our discovery of 5 Whitehead photos taken between 1877 and 1879, when Whitehead would have been just 16 to 18 years old. It is rather shocking to see Whitehead with hair. The earliest photo I had previously seen was from 1898, when Whitehead would have been 37, and he was already bald. 2 of these photos show Whitehead with his class, while the other 3 are of Whitehead with the football or rugby team, which he captained from 1879 to 1880. Whitehead was apparently quite a good rugby player. An issue of the student magazine in 1880 called him the best forward the school has ever had. Just as we are unused to thinking about Whitehead playing sports, we are unused to really thinking about his style of living in England at the time. But I cannot be the only one to have watched the recent and wildly popular British period drama Downton Abbey and wondered, with a start, whether Whitehead employed servants living in England as he did around the same time. As it turns out, Whitehead did in fact employ a number of servants during his time at Grantchester, where the Whiteheads lived from 1899 to 1907, and which his son North recalls in amusing detail, and here I quote at length. "Neither of my parents had any money. We lived on what my father earned, and the salaries of university dons were far from ample by any standard. Our house was a modest one, and many of our friends lived in a bigger way than we did. We had living in the house, besides my mother and father and 3 children, a cook, a maid, a child's nurse, and, for much of the time, a governess. But we also had some help from the village, a daily girl, a tweenie, who seemed to do most of the work, chased around by the others who were learning her. We also had a full-time gardener who usually turned up drunk. Then an adolescent boy, the Boots, used to clean our boots every morning and also clean the table knives. I think that's all, except that we had Mother Heifer once or twice a week, who did the washing in the washroom beyond the kitchen and a little rough cleaning around the house. So in addition to the family, we had 4 people living in the house and 4 more on full or part-time who slept in the village. Interesting that people who North describes as not having any money still employed 8 servants. It was a very different time and a very different social order. And even though North describes his parents' household as less formal than most, it was formal enough that meals were all tightly scheduled and preceded by a gong, and for dinner, 2 gongs. with the first dressing gong being sounded about 20 to 30 minutes before dinner. North described meals as having a formal, parade-like quality that resembled an army mess. Unfortunately, there's very little information about the Whiteheads' home life and how it evolved throughout their later time in England and later in the United States, although a few scattered references confirm that they continued to employ a number of servants after their move to London. We do know that during their time in America, they employed a full-time maid named Mary, who sailed with them from England, as was usual at the time for Americans with the Whiteheads' income. Descriptions of graduate students helping to prepare refreshments during Sunday evening visits suggest that they likely had few other servants during their time in America, although there is a reference to Whitehead having a chauffeur to take him back and forth from his home to his classroom during his last years of teaching in the mid-30s. But now I will move on and discuss Whitehead in America, starting with his arrival. Whitehead's salary was, of course, donated in secret by Julia Isham Taylor and Henry Osborne Taylor, who were most anxious that he should never know from whence the funds for his appointment came. In the course of Harvard extending Whitehead's appointment from 5 years to a permanent position, Lawrence J. Henderson wrote to President Lowell that he believed Whitehead had never suspected Taylor, and that even if he knew, it would be well to keep up the fiction of anonymity. Included with his salary was $1,000 for moving expenses. It was paid into a new American bank account for Whitehead rather than sent to England in order to avoid 1/3 of it being taken as income tax. The Whiteheads' time in America differed from their time in England from the very moment they stepped onto the Boston Harbor dock on August 27, 1924. Evelyn recalled that the immigration inspector inquired as to the purpose of their visit. To lecture on Einstein and the theory of relativity, Whitehead replied, and the inspector asked, "Tell me, Professor, what is the theory of relativity?" Whereupon Whitehead commenced his first lecture on the wharf. That, said Mrs. Whitehead, could only happen in America. There were other things that could only happen in America, such as Evelyn's introduction to a uniquely American plant during their first year. In a letter to his son North, Whitehead wrote that we picked a wonderfully decorative wildflower like a gigantic wild mint. She crushed the leaves in her hands and put her face in it to smell. As Lowe Riley remarked, this was an English woman's introduction to poison ivy. During that first year, not many students were brave enough to take Whitehead's course for credit. For his lecture courses, which took place on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays for about an hour, his grading notebook lists only 10 names, 6 at Harvard and 4 at Radcliffe. But this paltry number was not anywhere near the number of people who actually showed up. Some as official auditors, some not. Whitehead wrote in his notebook that the total number of people attending his first semester of Harvard lectures was plus or minus 30. The second year was much the same. It was not until year 3 that the number of registered students suddenly jumped to more than 40, and for most of his time at Harvard it appears that he had about 40 to 50 students and or visitors in the room at his lectures at any one time. It is interesting to note also that not all of these visitors were men. Although Whitehead lectured at Radcliffe separately, the division was not always as sharp as might be thought, and sometimes Radcliffe students would sit in on the Harvard lectures, which Whitehead mildly disapproved of. Joseph Brennan tells an amusing story of one such occasion. One day a Radcliffe visitor installed herself in the first row right under his nose and sat smiling eagerly up at him. "By the by," he mused plaintively, pausing to gaze out the nearest window, "if there are any persons present who are not registered members of this course, perhaps they might sit another time toward the back of the room where I cannot see them." It is important to note that Whitehead's discomfort here almost assuredly had more to do with his desire to follow the rules, or at least not flaunt them quite so obviously, than it did with the women's presence per se. By all accounts we can find, Whitehead was on the right side of history in being an advocate for women's equality at a time when this was not always a popular cause or attitude. For instance, he was 4 degrees for women at Cambridge in 1896, when students were against it by almost 4-1. He also spoke at a meeting of the Cambridge Women's Suffrage Association on November 6, 1906, with his speech later being printed and distributed as a pamphlet. But Harvard at the time was not lacking in misogynists. In fact, in an email exchange I had earlier this year with Stephen Kaiser, the son of Hillis Kaiser, one of Whitehead's TAs in the early 1930s, he wrote that, my father came out of Harvard as a misogynist and a true believer in the inferior position of women in society. It was also, of course, rather difficult for women to gain high academic positions, and few managed it. Of Whitehead students, Suzanne Langer and Dorothy Emmett were two of the exceptions to this rule, and we luckily have some class notes from both. I was amused to discover from Langer's notes, by the way, that she was apparently a great Harvard football fan. At the beginning of any of Whitehead's lectures that were also game days, she would write the name of Harvard's opponent, presumably as a reminder to herself to attend the game later that day. One woman's story stands out for me above the others. In the course of attempting to track down Whitehead students in a bid to perhaps find more class notes for our project, I found myself this past September contacting Dr. Carolyn Bynum, who is the daughter of Dr. Merle Bernice Grubbs Walker, a Whitehead student from 1932 to 33. Dr. Bynum told me that she knew for a fact that none of her mother's notes from Whitehead's courses survived because she had burned them when she gave up the academic career that she so craved. In her own words, when her second child was born and she decided to give up her job at Georgia State College for Women to do what she and my father both felt was right, stay home with the children, she burned all her notes from graduate school in a fierce and self-punishing act of renunciation. I grew up with a sense, learned partly from my father, that high-achieving women were peculiar and threatening, that there was something shameful about my mother's academic past. I also grew up with a sense, learned from her, that to be female is to make acts of self-sacrifice and self-denigration. It is perhaps some form of poetic justice that Dr. Walker's daughter later became the first woman to be appointed university professor at Columbia. I was also happy to be able to share with Dr. Bynum that, according to Whitehead's grading notebook, her mother was the only student in Whitehead's Radcliffe class that semester to earn an A+, though in some ways this only compounds the tragedy of lost potential. Dr. Walker's story strikes me as an important one to remember, representing, as it does, the stories of countless women from the early to mid-1900s who would be forced away from academia by the social prejudices of the time. But let's move now to an account of Whitehead himself as seen by his students. What were these lectures actually like, and what did his students think of him? First, there was his look, of which we've all probably seen enough pictures to be familiar. Richard Buke described him as having an old-fashioned Victorian appearance, and Louis Foyer said he was adorned by clothes such as I had seen before only in 19th century prints. He wore a black suit of clerical cut, a high starched wing collar, a cravat, often a rich blue, and a Prince Albert frock coat. Whitehead himself thought that he resembled the Dickens character Mr. Pickwick. As to his manner, he was often described by his students as seeming even a bit older than his years, walking slowly with his shoulders a little bent. Despite this, he was not unenergetic. As described by Louis Foyer, though he looked physically like the oldest man in the world, I had never seen an adult radiate so much energy and enthusiasm. He would often sit at a desk on the lecture platform, but would rise from it either to draw a diagram on the blackboard or simply to pace about energetically when there was some point he wanted to emphasize. Then there was his voice. There are no known audio recordings of Whitehead, but many students wrote about how he sounded. In general, his speech was slow, gentle, and high-pitched. Richard Buke described it as dulcet and flute-like, and Foyer said it contained a sing-song soprano-like enthusiasm. We also know, as demonstrated by some amusing examples, that he had what might be considered a slight speech impediment, with his R's often sounding like W's. The most spectacular example of this appears in the notes of W.V.O. Quine, who at one point recorded Whitehead as saying of Plato that he definitely denies a frozen world of everlasting fixtures. We are lucky here that Quine was a bit mischievous and undertook to record Whitehead's words exactly as he heard them. But apparently none of this kept Whitehead from occasionally correcting what he saw as mispronunciations by his students. One of Whitehead's teaching assistants in the 1930s, Hillis Kaiser, liked to tell of how Whitehead would often correct the pronunciations of Greek names or words by Greg Vlastos, a Greek student who grew up in Athens and graduated from college there, but hadn't studied Greek in England. Whitehead was apparently quite witty when he wanted to be. He himself opined that students at Harvard are less witty and less irreverently epigrammatic than analogous Cambridge undergraduates, but they greatly enjoy anything in that way which is put before them. Anne Morrow Lindbergh recalled that when she and her husband visited the Whiteheads in 1940, he had a saint-like quality that made his humor and sometimes even sardonic wit rather a shock when it came. He was apt to summarize his lectures with a humorous anecdote and punctuate his points with simple and humorous examples, such as that half a sheep is mutton, or this discussion of the validity of scientific experiments. The invariable success of a proof of experiment does not mean that the description is necessarily the right one. Some peoples have thought that the setting sun was swallowed by a dragon, and to the end of saving the sun from destruction, they performed certain religious rites. These ceremonials were always successful. Whitehead's lecture courses tended to be straight lectures without much interruption or discussion. He did not often invite questions, nor were many offered. He was also heard to say that although he prepared his lecture notes on the day he presented them, he found he needed to wait until the lecture itself to find the right phrasing. And in finding that phrasing, he was often seen to stare out the window while he talked. Harvey Potoff wrote, "How often in a lecture he looked out the back window from his desk in the front of the room, and as he talked apparently became totally oblivious to those in the classroom as he has grappled with some great problem for which he almost seemed to have a solution." But despite the fact that Whitehead preferred to lecture with little interruption from students, this is not to say that he was uninterested in hearing from them. Quite the contrary. It was his habit to wait a while after the lecture was concluded and talk with any students who wished to do so, which typically took about 20 to 30 minutes after the hour-long lecture. And then, of course, there were his Friday seminaries, which were much more discussion-based, and the famous Sunday evening get-togethers at Whitehead's home, at which Alfred and Evelyn would hold court for up to 100 students and other friends, offering conversation, hot chocolate to drink, and cakes to nibble. The Friday seminaries, in fact, also took place at Whitehead's home rather than in Emerson Hall. George Conger noted that it was usually around the dining room table, and that almost everyone except Whitehead himself smoked, creating a rather thick cloud. The students were as responsible for driving the discussion as Whitehead was, with 2 or 3 students making presentations each session. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, was one of Whitehead's students during his first logic seminary in spring 1925, and at one point wrote to a friend that, "I have got to debate with Whitehead at the seminar next week, and I am already trembling." But Oppenheimer enjoyed his time in the seminary, saying that reading the Principia with Whitehead was an exciting time, and that Whitehead was the perfect teacher because he was 10 years removed from the Principia and had forgotten most of it. So that he was both master and student as they worked through the text, occasionally coming to a theorem that puzzled him and saying, "Well, that was one of Bertie's ideas." In case you're wondering, Whitehead awarded Oppenheimer a B for his efforts in the course. Not everyone enjoyed Whitehead's seminaries. His biographer, Victor Lowe, has said that he found them rather boring, and that Whitehead seemed to assume that every seminar student was a genius. Lowe recalled sitting near the back of the room during these seminars and playing blindfold chess with a classmate during student presentations, i.e. playing chess without a board while keeping track of the game in his head, but would perk up his ears whenever Whitehead spoke. But it's perhaps worthwhile to stop for a moment and discuss this comment that Whitehead thought that all of his seminar students were geniuses. Although it's true that he was an easy grader, awarding mainly A's and B's, the larger and more important point is that Whitehead was a generous thinker and a thoroughly non-confrontational person. He was extremely patient of criticism of his own thought, but his criticisms of others were few and almost invariably gentle. At times, this could actually create problems. Paul Weiss recalled, for instance, that Whitehead was not a good dissertation director. As Weiss put it, "He was quite amiable and friendly, but he never gave me any really sharp criticisms. When I presented my thesis, I thought I had his approval. The department turned it down. I hadn't realized that he hadn't altogether thought it was a good thing." He also affected what Joseph Brennan referred to as his celebrated air of modest ineffectuality, serving to disarm whoever he was conversing with. From all this, one might conclude, as Weiss did, that Whitehead would have made a poor administrator. But there is ample evidence that this is untrue and not just arising from the time he spent in high administrative positions in England. As Russell put it, Whitehead had a shrewdness enabling him to get his way on committees in a manner astonishing to those who thought of him as abstract and unworldly. He made his genial and non-confrontational manner work for him in a way that allowed him to steer groups in the direction that he wanted them to go, an ability illustrated in the following story relayed by Tresillian Nicholas, former bursar of Trinity. The question before the meeting was whether any pressure should be put upon undergraduates to attend services in the college chapel, in those days a battleground between the clerical and anti-clerical parties in the college. The discussion culminated in a particularly violent speech by the philosophy professor James Ward, denouncing a clerical fellow whom he considered cynical. I wondered what would happen next, when an elderly fellow of benign appearance and mellifluous voice rose to his feet and began a miniature filibuster with a series of unexceptional remarks having no obvious connection with the resolution under discussion, which he continued until passions died down. The resolution was at once put to a vote, resulting in an overwhelming defeat for the clerical party, and the matter has never been raised again. I recognized a junior mathematical fellow and asked who it was who had saved the situation. He replied, "Oh, don't you know that was Alfred North Whitehead, the man who discovered what numbers mean?" In fact, in assessing Whitehead's administrative abilities, Russell thought that he had only one weakness, which was an inability to answer letters. Whitehead was rather famously bad at this, enough that when he took up his post at Harvard, many of his English friends claimed to never hear from him again. One story about Whitehead's letter writing across 3 different sources really brought this home for me. George Perigo Conger, an assistant professor in philosophy at the University of Minnesota and later its chair, spent the 1926-27 academic year attending every one of Whitehead's lectures and seminars that he possibly could. He wrote in his journal that on Friday, March 18th, at the last seminary meeting which he was to attend, Whitehead offered to write him letters of introduction to anyone he wished, and Conger sat by as Whitehead wrote out quick letters to J.J. Thompson of Trinity College, Bertrand Russell, and George Santayana. Brian Henning later discovered a short letter from Santayana to Conger in a bound volume of Santayana's letters, dated a few months later, telling Conger that he would be happy to meet with him in either Rome or Paris, depending on the date. He also said that, "You might have introduced yourself without the intervention of Professor Whitehead, but I am glad to have a word from him for other reasons." Imagine my amusement then when I found the following in an article by another of Whitehead's students, Louis Foyer. Evelyn would gently rebuke Professor Whitehead in public for not answering his letters. For months he's had a letter from Santayana on his desk. It would take but a page to reply, but he never writes it. Whitehead sat by meekly. While I'm on the subject of letters, there's one recently discovered one that I cannot resist sharing a portion of. Sent to Henry Osborne Taylor on August 28, 1928, Whitehead briefly discusses his experience of delivering the Gifford lectures. He writes, "I think that the Giffords went well. Some of the middle lectures were rather too closely reasoned for verbal delivery even to a Scotch audience. But on the other hand, the last lecture was, in my judgment, the best that I've ever delivered, whatever be the work of that level." While this does not precisely contradict J.M. Whittaker's famous account in Lowe's biography of Whitehead's audience dwindling from several hundred to only half a dozen, it does seem to suggest that Whittaker may have been exaggerating. And it's interesting to see that Whitehead himself thought highly of what would become the last chapter of Process and Reality, which is so often held up by Whitehead scholars as some of his finest work. But now I want to pivot and briefly discuss some of the difficulties involved in gathering and editing the archival materials on which the critical edition is based, which will hopefully provide food for thought as we head into our discussion of editorial practices. It took about 10 years for the Whitehead Research Project to produce this first volume, at least partly because of the difficulty of gathering materials, given that Whitehead famously asked for all his papers to be burned upon his death. The Victor Lowe collection at Johns Hopkins certainly provided a good start, but Lowe could not and did not find everything, and even some of what he did find remains problematic for us as editors. One example of problematic materials is the few notes we have from Edward Shooten Robinson, who attended Whitehead's first 2 years of lectures. Robinson sent 410 pages of his notes to the Yale Philosophy Club in the early 1960s, which were to be transcribed as part of the club's Whitehead project. However, they abandoned the effort in 1966 due to a lack of resources and interest, and sent the notes back to Robinson having transcribed only 77 pages of them, or less than 20%. 2 years later, in 1968, Robinson was struck and killed by a car while crossing the street. He had no immediate family, and the person who ended up being his heir, a distant cousin from Switzerland, seems to have disposed of the notes, not knowing their value. What we are left with is a partial transcription that, in the words of the Yale Philosophy Club itself, was not proofread against the manuscripts, meaning that it is likely rife with errors. Besides having some manuscripts such as the one for Robinson which are not original, there are some others for which we do have the original and yet encounter other difficulties that potentially limit their usefulness. One such collection of notes is the one by Victor Lowe from fall 1929, which uses a shorthand that is extremely brief and seemingly unique to him, making it rather a bear to decipher, and quite possibly impossible in places where we do not have other notes taken at the same time with which to compare them. Another is the 1925-26 notes of Charles Hartshorne, which he discovered by chance in 1978 and then edited before sending them on to the Center for Process Studies. In doing this editing, the pages were rearranged in an order which we now know through a painstaking comparison with the notes of Fritz Jules Roethlisberger to be rather magnificently wrong. Meanwhile, sometime between when Dr. Faber transcribed the notes for process studies in 2001 and my arrival on the project in 2013, the original Hartshorne notes were lost, leaving us with 4 different photocopies of the notes that all have different page orders and different handwritten addendums and markings on them. How does one begin to sort out this kind of mess? Are such compromised materials even worth publishing? My light question to this one is how to handle multiple sets of notes from the same lectures. Though this first volume of the critical edition reproduced the full text of all 3 sets of notes we had available for Whitehead's first year, 2 rather different sets from Harvard and 1 from Radcliffe, at times we have more repetitious material than is feasible to publish in full. For instance, we have 3 full and 1 partial set of notes for the Harvard lectures of 1930 to 31. Is publishing all 4 really reasonable or helpful to the majority of Whitehead scholars who will be examining them? I think, in fact, that in going forward with future critical edition volumes, we will be forced to make some hard choices about which materials to include and which to exclude, at least as full standalone texts. But I also think that it will be important to make as much use of the excluded material as we can to both corroborate and augment our chosen published text where appropriate. Most students, after all, are selective in their note-taking, and so will take detailed notes at one moment while taking few, if any, at another, and so the usefulness of having multiple sets can hardly be overestimated. At the very least, they can be used, as already mentioned, to properly interpret difficult shorthand, as in Lowe's notes, and to reorder and properly date disorganized notes, such as Hartshorne's. I now want to take a look at a few pages of a specific case study, a comparison of notes from Whitehead's Philosophy 3B in 1930-31 taken by W.V.O. Quine, Charles D. Tenney, and Furman G. McLarty, and a few of the surprising little ways in which having several sets of notes from the same class can shift interpretation, and how we might begin selecting one set to represent them all. In his lecture of October 21st, 1930, Whitehead gave a chronology of major philosophical figures of the transitional period from the end of the Hellenic Age to the Middle Ages, starting with Plato and ending with Augustine, including both birth and death dates. In discussing Augustine, Whitehead mentioned that the Vandals were about to sack the city in which he was living when he died. And here comes the point of interest, the name of that city. Tenney mentions no specific city. McLarty has it as Nola, but crossed this out and wrote Hippo. Meanwhile, Quine also has Nola, but crossed it out and wrote Tagast. So, what exactly is going on here? As luck would have it, McLarty clears up most of this at the beginning of his notes for the October 28th. He writes, erratum, Whitehead, by slip of the mind, asserted a few lectures back that Augustine died in Nola, North Africa. He meant to say Hippo, North Africa. Augustus Caesar died at Nola, South Italy. This explains why McLarty had crossed out the Nola in his earlier notes and written Hippo. But why then does Quine have Tagast? Well, I have a theory about that based partly on another difference between the three sets of notes within the very same lecture. For the birth date of Philo, McLarty has 20 BC with a question mark, while Quine has 26 BC with no question mark. If we had just the two sets of notes, the most reasonable explanation would seem to be that McLarty was not sure if he had heard Whitehead correctly, while Quine did. Hence, Quine's date is the one that Whitehead actually said. However, Tenney also has 20 BC with a question mark. That not one, but two of the three have a question mark is interesting, and suddenly the most reasonable explanation is very different. It seems now that it was Whitehead himself who was uncertain about the date, and that Quine filled in what he thought to be the proper date himself. Both 26 BC and 20 BC are dates that have been advanced by different historical scholars as estimations of Philo's date of birth. When Whitehead said he wasn't sure, McLarty and Tenney noted that fact, while Quine took it as permission to write in a date he happened to remember from a different source, both because he had a mind like a steel trap and because he seemed to be a bit of a know-it-all. It seems like something that Quine would do. And I feel fairly certain that this is how Tagast ended up in Quine's notes as the city where Augustine died. He quickly realized that Whitehead was wrong when he said Nola, then crossed it out and wrote what he thought was the correct city based on the recollections of that steel trap mind of his. As it happens, he was wrong. Tagast was the place of Augustine's birth, but not his death. After hearing this, you might think that McLarty's notes would be the ideal set to use as a base, since he's the only one who caught all of this detail and then went back and made the proper correction. But of course, these few examples don't tell the whole story, because McLarty's notes have their own deficiencies. He seemed to struggle more than the other two to keep up with the pace of the lecture, often leaving blanks to fill in information he'd missed, blanks that ultimately stayed as blanks. In other words, he marked things in a way that, in other cases, he marked things in a way that would be impossible to interpret without the other note sets. Take the dates that Whitehead associated with Euclid. McLarty writes them as 306 to 285 with brackets. What do the brackets mean? Quine has the answer. In time of Ptolemy Soter, ruler of Egypt, in 306 to 285 BC. So the dates actually refer to Soter rather than Euclid, a fact that would have been hard to discover based solely on McLarty's brackets. Meanwhile, Tenney did not bother to record the dates of Soter's rule and instead wrote that Euclid was born about 300 BC. In another case, that of Epicurus, McLarty began to write his birth date but never finished. He had just 34, followed by blanks, while both Tenney and Quine had 342 to 270. Of course, it would be premature to extrapolate final conclusions about these three sets of notes and their authors based solely on these examples. But from this admittedly very preliminary outlook, it would appear that Quine was the most proficient and knowledgeable of the three, but was also the least conscientious. He rarely dated his notes, and as I've shown, apparently did not feel much compunction about amending Whitehead's lectures without noting that he was doing so. McLarty may be the most conscientious note-taker of the three, but often struggled to keep up the pace. Tenney, who I am least qualified to judge right now as I have not finished transcribing his notes, seems somewhere in the middle. Anecdotally, Tenney's and McLarty's notes seem to match more closely than Quine's do with either of them. The irony here is that Quine's philosophical ability actually hindered the accuracy of his notes. While the other two were simply writing down what Whitehead said, Quine was evaluating it on the fly and making corrections and additions where he thought necessary. If you're going to pick one of these sets of notes to use as a base, which one do you pick? It's an interesting question, and not one easily answered. What's certain is that it is a very good thing indeed to have the luxury of multiple people covering the same material. Without multiple authors, it is impossible to see many of the eccentricities of the note-takers themselves. Without McLarty, we would not know that some of the things that Quine writes are not what Whitehead actually said. Without Quine, we would not know some of the things that McLarty and Tenney left vague or missed completely. All of this is to say that we have a rather long road ahead of us as editors of the CEW and face many editorial challenges in bringing this new material to light in the most useful and beneficial possible form. But I'd like to think that we're up to the challenge. Questions or comments?
Two things. things. One, why did he insist on burning his material? Was it his humility? Do we know why he insisted?
He has said before that he was more interested in, rather than people idolizing him and fetishizing him, that he rather that they just take his work and do their own from it and not spend time poring over his own. But also he was an intensely private person. Victor Lowe talked about this at the beginning of his biographies, and probably didn't want a lot of his letters to Evelyn getting out to the general public.
The second thing I was thinking of at the end of your comments there, that the editorial question made me think of textual biblical scholars having to reconstruct. Maybe that's the way, reconstruct a text, and then maybe in digital form have the original sources, the multiple copies, the later textual analysis, but you may have to engage in that.
Yeah, George made that same comment in his upcoming paper, The Comparison to Biblical Texts.
Except they're not original sources.
There's the problem. Yeah.
They're copies.
Yeah,
and
sure.
all
Yeah.
of the problems that
That's
notes have.
Yep.
That's true.
Yeah, but it's a nice.
But a parallel type
the idea
demonstration, like
that,
Joe has
this
up
is
there.
a perfect example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would at least help us,
Yeah.
say, well, what seems to be, if you somehow, using a Russellian metaphor, if you could somehow normalize all these onto the same graph, what would end up being the thing shared by all?
Yeah.
That would be the closest you get to a transcript of Whitehead.
And that's good, Whitehead.
Yeah.
All you have to do is close.
Close. I'm close enough. It's good
With a
enough.
series of footnotes.
Yeah, with a series of footnotes.
Well, right now, given that you're knee deep in all this, and I haven't finished Henning, but what would be your answer to this particular set? This would be volume 4, if my memory serves.
Yes.
So let's say we're doing volume 4, and usually the way that the the guide to documentary editing recommends that you pick a source text, meaning it's the one that you use as your, so Bell is our source text, our primary, and the others are secondary. So if you had to pick now, what would you pick?
I would probably pick McGlarty.
Really?
For the reasons I stated. And, sure, he had blanks, he didn't always keep up, but again, it's useful to know that, hey, there's a block here of stuff I don't have, and you can see that in
And
your
then
base
go get it
transcription,
from
and then go
somebody
get
And
it
you
from someone
reflect
else.
it in notes?
Yes. Well, and this is another deeper discussion, but how much can we or do we want to get into the mess of actually intercutting them? Is that something that we can feasibly do without it becoming just hopelessly messy? That's a hard question, and one that we haven't really fully come to terms with. We've had some preliminary discussions about that, but this wasn't something that was faced by the first volume where we just published everything, which is great. But when we have a certain amount, it just becomes, well, we can't do all 4 of these.
One of the great things about the Bell notes, as Paul found, and he just numbered the lectures 1 through what, Paul?
82.
85.
Yes.
Because Bell was so assiduous and so careful. But in subsequent notes, people are very sporadic about when they choose to note the date
Yes.
at the top of their note.
Yep.
It happens here and then there and there. So we got 3 sets of notes, but nobody does the same date at the same time. So then how do you, Paul was able to say, well, this is what Bell said and what Hawking said on the same day, one after the other. But it's much harder to do when you don't have dates. So it's a weird problem.
Helmut has a
I
comment.
just would like to add, the lecture notes are taken for each person for himself.
Yes.
For his future study.
Yeah.
So, in any literary criticism, of course, you have to ask, who's the audience you are writing for? It's the author himself. So, each of these will have this subjective drive in it, and necessarily so.
Yeah.
So, the only thing is, as you were suggesting as well, there might be certain similarities in all 3 of them, and then the one which has most overlaps is with the others might be the sort of guiding text, but still you won't be able to get rid of the subjective intention of either of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Which, one of the questions I want to bring up just in a minute in the editorial discussion is what that implies for being able to quote these works. do we get to attribute them to Whitehead in an unqualified way? And so that's one of the things we need to
It's maybe
discuss as a community.
maybe a little safer when they actually do put quotation marks around things, as sometimes happens. But yeah, it's hard.
I wonder, in Wine's notes, is there any reflection of his distaste for metaphysics in general? Distaste for Whitehead's metaphysics in particular?
Yes.
No, I don't know if that's true. I didn't find that in the notes, and he did an interview with Whitehead, which I'm excited that we'll publish
Yeah.
eventually. Whitehead, and I found him nothing but attentive and interested, and completely unlike everything that comes after. And so I found him to
He
be.
reflected.
I didn't find it to be irreverent, or I mean, he's kind of a jackass, but that's just a personality flaw.
He came to Harvard with a sense of reverence, but he came to Harvard with a reverence for Whitehead. He wasn't considered mathematics.
You're right. That's right. He said that, and that is true. He was disappointed about that.
Right.
Yeah, he was definitely disappointed about not getting that. Yeah.
I had, when I was in seminary, 4 of us went to a series of lectures by the German theologian Oscar Kuhlmann. Our task was to get a full and adequate summary of each of those sessions. So one of us concentrated on the organization, the outline, the structure of the argument, another on certain kinds of key ideas in the thing, one of them on any German words used in it that, and what they would mean, and off now, I can't remember what the 4th was. And then after the lectures, we sat down and collated those. Now,
Wow.
you always have to have an ideal, right? And of course, it was wonderfully better than almost anything anybody else could possibly have done, but it was inadequate.
Yeah.
For the simple reason that you're just leaving so much out. None of us, even working in coordination like that, could get anywhere close to what would be an image of the original. So it's what you want something that captures what is the fundamental argument of the thing, and somehow balances against those things.
But George, just a point of clarification, did you hear those, all 4 of you hear him lecture and then have these assigned duties?
Yeah.
Okay, so you all went to the lecture, the live lecture, planning to
To do
file it after the fact.
But
God, wouldn't that have been?
It occurred to me that one of the questions that to try to puzzle out, and I don't know how you do it at this distance, was who in the class were in fact sharp in philosophy,
Heirs.
and who are the ones that are good in understanding class presentation, good pedagogues and whatnot, who will be looking for different things, because it does come back to notes taken as much as anything for your own interests.
Right.
I mean, we do have his grade book now, so that helps. We got his grade book just this past
Except they're all A's.
June.
No, they're not. They're not. That's
I did
false.
see a B.
There is some.
Quite a few B's.
No. I just. I mean, I'll say in my comments, right? But it's not true
Yeah.
that he was a really generous grader.
Yeah.
He gave C's and D's.
He was like
and
any other
E.
graduate
I don't even know what an E is.
instructor.
But
Nobody
one.
gives a C.
Now, there are-
Very, very.
I would say that those C's and D's are pretty few and far between.
Yeah, but I don't see him as that much different than mine. I don't know about your grades, but mine are not that different than his. There's a cultural difference too. I don't know what the UK's. Maybe he was generous according to UK standards. I don't know, but according to American standards, I don't think he was that out of line.
I don't think it's just UK, it's Cambridge University and Trinity College. Whitehead was not as interested in grades. He was interested in spotting creative genius. That's what he was interested in. And Cambridge University had a system which Quine became a beneficiary at Harvard. That is, if someone had a tremendous, unique, creative genius, that person was exempted from all requirements to get their doctorate. And that happened to Quine.
Right.
And that was something that Whitehead brought to Cambridge University. I cite that because Whitehead brought it there. He applied it to the student had a partial interest and respect for Whitehead, unlike Leonard, who was both a mathematician and a metaphysician. A completely different relationship to Whitehead, who was his personal assistant for 7 years at Harvard. But I think it's important to realize that attitude and that judgment. He wasn't searching for brilliance, he was searching for genius.
May I just add something? That's the reason why he was able to put, to grant to Russell in his first year the scholarship, although he, as far as marks were concerned, he was only second. And that was a general attitude, that if you evaluated a person as being the brighter of writers, he would get the scholarship, regardless, so to speak, of marking.
Totally correct in my judgment. Because at the end of Whitehead's metaphysics, what did he come to see as the most fundamental feature of the universe? It's creativity. So that's what that virtue of a creativity, originality, opening new vistas, not just repeating the past, but leading us into the future. New vistas.
The only thing that worries me about the narrative about Weiss, because using my own sort of comments to balance yours that I haven't delivered yet, but and probably won't get to because of the time constraints, is that Weiss was there for a very, very, very short amount of time.
Right.
He was there for a blisteringly short amount of time and makes these characterizations of Whitehead of not giving much feedback. I think Weiss is a distinguished, like a particularly bad person to look to for information on this, because he was just he was a very particular personality in the way that we see the letter that Whitehead wrote to Weiss when Weiss submitted as counter evidence to your claim. I was just saying this to George Lucas, that Whitehead reviewed the introduction that Weiss wrote for the Peirce papers and said it wasn't good, and that it was a really, really harsh, it was probably one of the most harsh critiques I've ever seen Whitehead write to
And
Weiss.
lengthy
And the
letter
idea
to
that
both,
Weiss
yeah.
wasn't getting
4 or
firm-
5 pages, yeah.
Right,
Pretty
and
dense.
Weiss, originally Whitehead was supposed to write the preface to the Peirce papers, and we don't know why he didn't. We just know that it shows up, his name shows up on an initial table of contents for the Peirce papers that never came to be. We can surmise what might have happened, but I just think whether Whitehead was especially generous, I don't think we have good evidence to say that he was overly. I'm not disputing what you're saying. I just don't want to use Weiss as an example of saying he just didn't give harsh feedback and he was overly generous. And this is probably being more consistent with your comments than anything else. I don't think he was overly generous and he didn't hold back when he thought he had a criticism to make. We have other counter evidence that
Right.
indicates that he did.
I think the most telling example, we were talking about it earlier, in the letter that Whitehead wrote to Leonard, which was published in the Library of Congress. This gentle soul.
The Wittgenstein-Russell comment?
Such a causticness.
Yeah, that was very uncharacteristic, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's a great letter, but it's very uncharacteristic.
It's not only great, it's historically significant.
Yeah.
Very, and it shows the point that I'm making also about genius. Because the most telling part is not the dismissing of the 3 bright boys. But the most telling part is his statement that if their modes of thought, that is rationalism, reductionism, hard-headed empiricism, had prevailed for 10,000 years, intellectual history would be that.
I agree. I agree. What the nice thing about Paul, or both good and bad thing about the Bell notes that Paul, so expertly edited, is it gives a false sense of security because Bell even notes his asides. He notes to himself. Paul can say this better than I. He even notes when he's making comments on the text of what Whitehead's saying. He puts it in square brackets. He says, "This is my," or he slips into German every now and then. That's a slightly different problem. But he's such a careful note taker, and no one else going forward is going to be that careful. They're not trying to be that careful.
Nor is competent. I mean, he had a degree in mathematics. He had gotten his PhD with Husserl. I mean, this was a guy who knew a little philosophy, whereas most of the notes we have are from students. And most of the students, as Whitehead sort of averred, didn't have quite what he was accustomed to in the background of mathematical physics and logic. in Cambridge. They didn't have that capacity in Emerson Hall. And so, you know, they're struggling, as we struggle, to read some of these materials. And so as to who's the brightest, I mean, there'll be someone who might be faithful in being able to hear and record, another kind of like Quine, who's capable intellectually of understanding anything if he cares to do so, but may not care to do so.
Right.
And then others who are just, well, frankly, just like, you know, are pedestrian about it, and so they do the best they can. And we're stuck with putting that all together.
Yep.
Yeah, it's.
I mean, there's one student whom Whitehead chose himself to write lecture, and that was Dr. M.
Yes.
And that's the only thing where he thought, you know, there's somebody who's really so good
Right.
that she should write it down for me in order
Yeah.
to prepare my defense.
That would be, I mean, we know the in a sense, the Harvard department de facto Winthrop Bell came to play that role in the first year, thank God. And then Whitehead later picked Dorothy Emmons to play that role later on. But there were no official notes of record otherwise that we know of.
I think Kirby Miller was trying to be kind of the notes of record for the years that he did it, because at that point he was,
He was a postdoc? Is that
I believe he was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was Whitehead's assistant at that point, but I don't, he didn't do as good a job as Bell did.
Do you have a question?
No, I just wanted to relate another episode concerning this habit of not answering letters.
Did you not get a letter?
Not yet.
Yeah, right there. It's in the post.
Which comes from, I don't even know the name, the person who became dean after Whitehead in London.
Ah.
And just a short story of how, before he took over office, he went into Whitehead's office in order to clear up some points, whatever. And he then encountered Whitehead at a desk filled with unopened envelopes, and just having carved out a small space in between where he was just able to place a sheet of paper, and he was busy writing an article on how to improve university administration.
Just work for my email.
Yeah.
We should take a break and then come back in about 10 or so minutes, and we'll have a roundtable discussion, kind of continuing some of this stuff, but focusing especially on sort of what the implications for moving forward in terms of editing and scholarship, given the first volume. Thank Joe again for his amazing work. Have another drink, and back here in 10.